We're going to look for a little bit at the rights that we have to our own bodies, and then we're going to go on and look at the rights that we have or don't have to a healthy environment. So let's start, first of all, with the rights that we have to our bodies. And let's start with our cells. So you'd think that we have a right to own our own cells. Well, sorry folks, but actually we don't. Some of you may have heard, particularly the researchers among you, may have heard of the HeLa cell line. The HeLa cell line is the most commonly used human cell line in biomedical research. And what I mean by a cell line is it is a group of human cells that will divide, replicate themselves indefinitely in a test tube or in a petri dish. So outside the human body, in other words, and that's why they are so valuable for biomedical research. So where did this cell line come from? Even though it doesn't exist as part of a human being right now, it is a human cell line, so obviously it came from somebody originally. Well, the HeLa cell line was derived from cells taken from an African-American woman in 1951. Her name was Henrietta Lacks. And the cell line was named after her. It's H-E-L-A, so her name was Henrietta, H-E, Lacks, L-A. And it was taken from her without her consent. She didn't know that her cells were going to be cultured or used in biomedical research. She had no idea at all. She or her family have never profited 1 cent from the use of her cells. And there was no consent given, as I said, by her or any members of her family to this day that I know of. It's just an extraordinary story. So this African-American woman who died from cancer a few months after these cells were taken, her cells are being used to this very day. There are now about 11,000 patents taken out on her cells. Her cells have been used in everything from polio research to cancer research. And the corporations that own these 11,000 patents to do this research benefit to the tune of several $100 million a year from her cells. So it seems that we don't own our own cells. At least the situation with prior informed consent has been improved since 1951. If you have cells taken from your body, you are meant to be asked to give your consent to that at this point, although you may not benefit from their use at all financially. So let's turn and look at our genes. So how many genes do you think you have in your body? Anyone? 30,000? Pretty close. It's estimated that we have between 20 and 25,000 unique genes in the human body. And the first complete map of the human genome was completed just a few years ago in 2003. But by 2005, as many of you may know, only about 2 years later, about 20% of the human genome had been patented by corporations or universities. So what does it actually mean to have a corporation or a university own the genes in your body? I can't quite get my head around that. I don't know if any of you can, but I find that really challenging. And among those genes that have been patented were the two genes that have been associated with breast cancer. In 2010, a district court judge struck down the patents on those two genes. The patents had been taken out by a company called Myriad. So people thought they'd run a real victory against the corporations in terms of gene patents, but unfortunately this ruling was largely overturned this year in federal court. So it looks like we don't actually own our own genes. It looks like, as I say, corporations or universities own at least 20% of them. So in an interesting, something I found kind of humorous about this was that several people have actually taken out patents on their bodies. The first of them, I understand, was a waitress in England. Her name was Donna McLean. And in 2000, even before the human genome had been mapped, she was getting concerned about the genes that had been patented even before that mapping was completed. And she took out a patent on the genes in her body, on her whole body. And in her patent application, this is what she said. She said, "It has taken me 30 years of hard labor for me to discover myself and to invent myself. And I now wish to protect my invention from unauthorized exploitation, genetic or otherwise." And as far as we know, her patent stands. Now, what that actually means in terms of real rights is debatable. But I think it was a very powerful stand that she took and other people have taken since her in order to protect their genetic material. So let's turn now to our tissues. So do we think we own our tissues? By that I mean our blood, our fatty tissue, our livers, our hearts, our lungs. Well, actually, probably not. I mean, yes, we can donate them in organ transplants, but the fact of the matter is that everyone here in this room tonight probably has levels of toxic chemicals in their tissues. Did you ever say to anyone that it was okay for them to contaminate your bodies? Did anyone ever say that? No, I kind of thought not. So the fact is that our blood, our serum, our hair, our teeth, our urine, our fatty tissues, our mother's milk, and our bone all contain toxic chemicals that we've been exposed to and that we've taken up into our bodies without our consent. So it seems that we have no right to control what actually ends up in our cells. This phenomenon is often called toxic trespass, and personally I think this is a great way to frame this issue, because it is a trespassing on your body of toxic chemicals. And over the last 50 years there have been numerous studies documenting the presence of toxic chemicals in a whole variety of different human tissues. The first of these toxic trespass studies was actually done by Barry Commoner. People know who Barry Commoner, ran for president, one of the fathers of the environmental movement, a wonderful person, wrote the 4 Basic Laws of Ecology. In 1958, Barry Commoner was very active in the anti-nuclear movement, and he launched a study in St. Louis, Missouri, where he lived at the time, that collected over 300,000 baby teeth. Why? Because the study looked at levels of strontium-90 in the baby's teeth, because at the time there was atmospheric nuclear testing going on, and one of the fallout isotopes is strontium-90. He wanted to track the levels of strontium-90 in babies' teeth, in human tissues, and the easiest one was babies' teeth. So that study went on for years and years and years, and what he showed was that the levels of strontium-90 actually declined after the Partial Test Ban Treaty was passed in 1963. So that was probably one of the first indications, or first studies that we had of toxic trespass. In the 1970s, then, the US government started to measure blood lead levels in children on a much more systematic level, and about the same time, the Canadian government started to do studies on levels of mercury in the hair of First Nations people living in northern Canada. Both sets of studies showed high results. At that time in the US, of course, we had leaded gasoline, and so the levels of blood lead in children were very high. And again, as lead in gasoline was banned gradually over time, was phased out and then banned over time, and we've seen a dramatic decrease in blood lead levels over time. And Steve Gilbert in the audience there is one of the researchers that's been involved with that work and reviewed some of those studies. The levels of mercury in First Nations people in northern Canada has not declined nearly as much, but has declined a little bit since then. By the 80s and 90s, there were more studies coming out looking at contaminants in other human tissues, including mother's milk, fat, and urine. Fat samples were collected from cadavers, certainly in Canada where I was working at the time. I can remember being involved in some of those early studies. And also I'm sure studies were happening down here. And over time, more and more contaminants were detected in human tissues. And all of those contaminants were linked with a variety of health effects, everything from cancer to developmental effects, to learning disabilities, and so on. In my view, the contamination of mother's milk is a particularly tragic side of toxic trespass. When toxic chemicals, persistent organic toxic chemicals, accumulate in mother's milk because it is fatty, and those chemicals like a fatty environment, so they accumulate in mother's milk, they are passed to a nursing infant. So although the mother is essentially excreting toxic chemicals, they are being taken up and absorbed by her infant. And on a personal note, one of the hardest decisions I ever had to make was when to stop breastfeeding my own son with this knowledge that I had about the levels of toxic chemicals in my own breast milk. Although the advice still is, and I think it's right, that women should breastfeed their infants, that the benefits do outweigh the risks. Nevertheless, there is a very significant risk, very significant levels of toxic chemicals are passed on to infants through mother's milk. And that just should not be so. Later on in the 1990s, the NHANES study, which stands for the National Health and Nutrition Examination Survey, started national biomonitoring studies in this country, and that's now expanded to about 300, looking at the presence of about 300 chemicals in a variety of tissues, and 4 national reports have been published in that time. In fact, there are now thousands of studies in the US and around the world documenting the presence of toxic chemicals in human tissues. In other words, documenting toxic trespass. This is no secret. Some of the highest levels are found in the Arctic, in human tissues in the Arctic, even though the sources of chemicals that are being found in those people are thousands and thousands and thousands of miles away. They are carried through air currents, through transboundary air pollution up to northern latitudes. And then when northern people eat wild fish and wild game, the contaminants concentrate in their tissues. Even in Washington State, we have evidence of toxic trespass. In 2005, the Washington Toxics Coalition analyzed blood and urine from 10 Washington residents and found that most of the residents had detectable levels of most of the substances that they analyzed for, including Teflon chemicals, you know your frying pan with Teflon? Yeah, Teflon chemicals, polybrominated diphenyl ethers, PCBs, phthalates, pesticides, DDT, mercury, lead, and arsenic. That's quite a list. I'm not just talking about 1 or 2 chemicals. I'm talking about dozens or even hundreds in some people. Aside from the fact that these substances can cause a wide range of health effects, they provide incontrovertible proof that toxic trespass is happening right here in Seattle. But does anyone really have the right to contaminate our bodies? Well, it seems like they do. But what about the Universal Declaration of Human Rights? What does that say on the subject? Well, Article 3 says that everyone has the right to life, liberty, and security of person, and I bolded that deliberately. To my mind, toxic trespass is a case of insecurity of the person. My body is not secure, neither's yours, because we are being trespassed upon by these toxic chemicals. Article 12 reads, "No one shall be subject to arbitrary interference with his privacy, family, home, or correspondence." Well, quite frankly, I feel like I'm being interfered with. 5 minutes, okay. So, obviously, that's my interpretation of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And I think that it does create an argument for or against toxic trespass. So what about the right to a healthy environment? Do we at least have the right to a healthy environment? Well, in 1972, the UN Conference on the Human Environment agreed. They said, in not quite exactly, but they said that we are entitled to an environment of equality that permits a life of dignity and well-being. So it's not quite the right to a healthy environment, but almost. In 1989, the UN went further and appointed Fatma Ketsini to study and report on the right to a healthy environment. And what she came up with in 1994 was a report on the subject that contained draft principles on human rights and the environment. And I'd like just to read the first principle that she came up with. And she was working with an international committee of legal experts. It wasn't just her working on her own. She said, "All persons have the right to freedom from pollution, environmental degradation, and activities that adversely affect the environment, threaten life, health, livelihood, well-being, or sustainable development within, across, or outside national boundaries." Wow, that sounds pretty strong to me. Well, of course, nothing was done with her draft principles, and they're just languishing in the vaults of some UN building. But good for her for saying that. Thankfully, in 2010, the UN General Assembly decided to add a couple of rights, and it overwhelmingly voted to approve the right to clean water and sanitation. That was just last year. Of course, the Obama administration decided to abstain from that vote. It was one of the few countries that did abstain, which is pretty remarkable to me. My point in going through this litany is that there is something of a right to a healthy environment. And even though we haven't been able to exercise it, it does provide a framework for social action on rights to an environment. So who does actually have the right to a healthy environment? Well, in fact, the residents of more than 60 countries, from Afghanistan to Vietnam, have the right to a healthy environment enshrined in their constitutions. South Africa's constitution reads, "Every person shall have the right to an environment which is not detrimental to his or her health or well-being." Pretty powerful, huh? Hungary's constitution recognizes and enforces the rights of everyone to a healthy environment. Even the tiny West African country of Burkina Faso has the right to a healthy environment enshrined in its constitution. So, do we have the right to a healthy environment in the US? No, we don't. The closest that we come to it is in the National Environmental Policy Act, passed in 1969, which I'm not going to bother to read because it's up there. In some ways, I would argue it's quite remarkable that we don't have the right to a healthy environment in the US, because the US was founded on the ideal of equal rights. The 1776 Declaration of Independence contains the words that we all know. "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, and they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights." So clearly the US is a rights-based society. Perhaps the founding fathers weren't thinking about the rights to a healthy environment in 1776, or perhaps early corporations of the day were thinking that such a right would impede their activities. Thomas is probably more of an expert on that than I am. But whatever the reason, this country does have a foundation of thinking of itself in terms of rights. And I believe that is a powerful argument that we can still use today. Having said that, rights is not always an easy, the right to a healthy environment won't be an easy sell in this country, because this country is so steeped in individualism. Individual rights, and in particular individual property rights, are one of the central themes in this country. And the right to a healthy environment is really a collective right. It's about the air we all breathe. It's about the water we all drink. It's about the land we all share. And when individual rights to do with our property as we think fit, pollute it, spray it with pesticides, build McMansions on it, whatever, when individual property rights come up against collective rights, it's sometimes the individual rights that come out on top, though not always. It is true, I understand, that some states, some individual states, do have the right to a healthy environment in their constitutions. So how can we use rights-based arguments in this country? Well, in fact, most social movements in the US and around the world have used rights-based arguments forever. In the 18th century, the abolitionist movement used the right to freedom to argue for the abolition of slavery. In the 19th century, the suffrage movement argued that women should have the right to vote the same as men. And in the 20th century, the civil rights movement made the case that African Americans should have equal rights under the law. All of these rights were based on were created or were set up as visions to aspire to. So I think the most famous of those is Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech, who framed the civil rights issue around a vision in which everyone could exercise their rights. That speech was so powerful, it was delivered 100 years after emancipation on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial, and it really created a rights-based vision for the civil rights movement, I would say, that even endures to this day. But simply framing issues in terms of human rights and having inspiring visions isn't enough. We really need to, what I call, mind the gap between our visions and the rights that idealized set of rights to a healthy environment, the gap between that and our everyday experience. In other words, our inability to exercise those rights. For example, to go back to the civil rights movement, they talked about the rights of African Americans to vote and then pointed out that African Americans actually could not vote. And that was all around the registration programs that they had in the southern states, the voter registration programs that actually showed, no, African Americans don't have the right to vote. When you contrast the right, whatever the right is, with the actual reality of what is going on in society, it introduces a gap. It introduces a kind of what I would call a cognitive dissonance between what we think we can do, what we think we have the right to do, and what we actually can do. And that cognitive dissonance gets very, very uncomfortable. And the more uncomfortable that it gets, the greater the pressure for social change. This is the very basis for social change, is when we contrast our ideals and the rights that we want to have and we want to exercise against the reality of our current lives. That's how social change happens, is in that gap. So it's a really important thing to do to highlight the rights that we have to a healthy environment. One of the few social movements that hasn't used this strategy is the environmental movement. And that's really unfortunate. Very few groups within the environmental movement are using rights-based arguments. The only one that I know of is the Alliance for a Healthy Tomorrow in Massachusetts, which has a tagline that reads, "Everyone has the right to a healthy environment." But even then, this organization does not use rights-based strategies in its campaigns very much. And I would argue that sustainability and environmental protection is fundamentally a rights-based issue. It's fundamentally an ethical issue about what should we do, who has the rights to do what with the environment, with our bodies. So in missing out on this argument, I believe the environmental movement has not done us a good service. The one notable exception to this is the environmental justice movement. Not surprisingly, the environmental justice movement grew directly out of the civil rights movement, when African Americans in the South realized that although they'd won the right to vote and desegregation, they didn't have the right to a healthy environment. And many communities were located, and still are, next to hazardous waste facilities and dump sites. Using the infrastructure of the old civil rights movement, including church groups, black neighborhood community groups. Yes, 1 minute, Richard. They early civil rights, environmental justice activists organized communities, especially in the South, starting in the 1980s and the 1990s. The first National People of Color Summit was held in 2001 in Washington, D.C., and through the 80s and the 90s, there was a proliferation of small local environmental justice groups, initially African American in the South, then spreading to Hispanic populations, and more recently also spreading to First Nations and Native populations, and more recently spreading to Asian and Pacific Island populations. Many of these groups still exist to this day. In 1994, there was an executive order signed by President Clinton requiring all federal agencies to consider environmental justice and to open up their decision-making processes to minority populations. And most recently, in Hurricane Katrina in 2005, we can see that we still are living with environmental injustice in this country. Many of the people most seriously affected were African American and lived in the 9th Ward close to the levees that broke. Okay, for the sake of time, I'm going to skip my next slide, which talks about environmental health disparities, and just briefly say, so why hasn't the environmental movement used this strategy? Because the environmental movement originated largely among white middle-class people who didn't perceive themselves as not having rights. That's where the environmental movement arose. They didn't see themselves as oppressed or as victims. They didn't lack rights. They didn't see themselves as being affected by poor environmental quality. It was somebody else. So it's hardly surprising that the environmental movement did not use a rights-based approach. It's true that deep ecologists have been talking about nature's rights for years, and I think Thomas is going to pick up on this in a minute. But expanding our thinking to the rights of nature can seem a little bit far-fetched when so many people lack the basic human right to a healthy environment. So I'd like to see the environmental movement and the sustainability movement really begin to use rights-based arguments. And I think the situation is beginning to improve. A couple of years ago, Gus Speth, who is a former dean of Yale Forestry and Environmental School and former White House advisor and well-known environmentalist, said that many established environmental issues should be seen as human rights issues. This is a pretty strong endorsement. It's a pretty strong direction. And I think he's absolutely right. So it seems as if environmental issues can be seen increasingly as human rights issues, and that's a very good thing, I think. And now I'm going to turn over to Thomas, who I think is going to talk about how to actually make that happen in action.
I'm going to read off a list of statistics that we actually presented in Mount Vernon at the Martin Luther King Jr. Day commemoration event. So here's some statistics. In the United States, 570 billion pounds of municipal waste is produced, with 60% of that waste ending up in landfills or incinerators. That's each year. 570 billion pounds of municipal waste. 4 billion pounds of toxic chemicals, including 72 million pounds of known carcinogens, are released into the atmosphere from 20,000 different industrial polluters across the United States. 2 trillion pounds of livestock waste laced with antibiotics, hormones, and chemicals are dumped into waterways and applied to land on an annual basis. 11 million people live within 1 mile of a federal Superfund site in this country. The use of fossil fuels for 85% of our energy use impacts the health of 6 million people in the United States, while of course warming and polluting the atmosphere and the planet. 80,000 industrial chemicals currently are in use in the United States, with more than 700 now found within each human body. And Kate made reference to this, the toxic trespass. 1,800 new chemicals are introduced annually. 1,800 new ones annually. 40% of our waterways in the United States fail to meet even the minimal requirements of federal and state clean water laws. 1/5 of all animal and plant species cling to the edge of extinction. Fisheries are collapsing, and deforestation has resulted in the removal of more than 90% of America's forests, America's original forests. It's pretty bleak out there. and the situation's worsening rapidly. So what do we do with these problems? What do we do with these massive problems that we wake up every morning, we read about in the newspaper every morning? Well, we write letters to Congress, urging them to do something. We hold protest marches. We buy Priuses. We invest in green stocks. We buy local. We bring our own bags to the grocery store. We change our light bulbs. We write letters to corporate CEOs begging them to do the right thing. As Derek Jensen, author, a friend of mine, I think he was one of the best writers of our generation in terms of being a heretic about how existing systems are set up. He says that taking those actions, which we're taught of as allowable activism, taught that we can do certain things as activists but can't do others, he compares that type of activism as a response to these huge monumental environmental problems we face. He says it's like the French resistance fighters vowing to compost to stop Hitler. He goes further in a piece called Beyond Hope, which some of you may have read. He's a columnist for Orion magazine. And I have to read this quote because it's my favorite one from Derek. He says, on our activism in general and how we actually work to try to solve these big problems. He says, quote, does anyone really believe that Weyerhaeuser is going to stop deforesting because we ask nicely? Does anyone really believe that Monsanto will stop Monsantoing because we ask nicely? If only we get a Democrat in the White House, things will be okay. If only we pass this or that piece of legislation, things will be okay. Nonsense. Things will not be okay. They are already not okay, and they're getting worse rapidly. Right? The problem is, even when we do confrontational activism in this country, when we move beyond the bringing our own bags to the grocery store and changing light bulbs and writing letters to corporate CEOs begging them to change their practices or writing letters to Congress begging them to do something that we know needs to be done, even when we move outside of that framework, we move into a regulatory framework, which is, for example, when a toxic waste incinerator is siting in a specific town or a specific municipality. Groups organize around the kitchen table. I think it's the only place that democracy happens anymore today, is around kitchen tables in communities that are facing these types of problems. And immediately what happens is they usually find a lawyer, and that lawyer tells them, well, what you need to do is appeal the permit that the state has issued to put this toxic waste incinerator in or this other project in. And so we begin fundraising for the lawyers in the communities. We begin fundraising to pay the lawyers to do the permit appeals under regulatory structures that the corporations wrote to actually ostensibly regulate themselves in the community when the communities rise up to try to challenge them. We wonder why after 40 years after the major environmental laws have been adopted in the United States, why things are worse today by almost every major environmental statistic than they were 40 years ago. And the answer is very complicated, but part of it is that our work isn't working. Our work is not working. The solutions and activism that we use are not commensurate with the problems that we face. And so the Legal Defense Fund, the Community Environmental Legal Defense Fund, which we founded in 1995 to do something quite simple, which was to provide free legal services to community-based environmental organizations. For 8 years, we spent time in the trenches doing these permit appeals that the state would issue. The state would issue a permit to a corporation to put a particular facility in. We would ride to the rescue on top of the white horse to the community group and say, we can help you. Never trust anybody that says we can help you. And the community group would say, well, please help us. And we would say, we'll help you. We'll come in. We'll appeal this permit that was written, issued by the state agency and under which the corporation is operating. And we would go into court and we would argue to the judge that the permit application that was submitted by the corporation was missing something. That's in essence what conventional environmental law is today, is that something's missing from the corporate permit application because they haven't dotted all their I's or crossed all their T's as they go through the regulatory process. We would find something missing. We would argue to the judge, Your Honor, under little 3, little c, little d, little Roman numeral 2, little I, little e, little 2, little c, that there wasn't a large enough bond posted for the road that's going into the toxic waste incinerator. And therefore the permit was issued wrongly, and now you need to repeal it and get rid of it and not have a toxic waste incinerator there. And what would happen next, of course, was that the corporate lawyers would come up to us, sometimes openly after we appeared in court to actually strike the permit down, and they would say to us, thank you very much. Thank you very much for identifying the deficiencies and the gaps and the omissions in the permit application that we submitted originally. to get this permit to issue from the state. Thank you very much. You've identified the bond that's missing. You identified the signature that's not there. You identified the macroinvertebrate water study that needed to be updated. And guess what? 30 days later, they would come back with a new permit application. And the community group would come to us and they'd say, Mr. Linzey, we need you to do that jujitsu again that you did with the judge the first time around to get this permit thrown out, because now we're faced with a toxic waste incinerator coming into the middle of our community. And we would say to them, we'd like to help. We're really sorry, but there's nothing for us to use anymore within the regulatory system because the corporation has now dotted all the I's and crossed all the T's. And eventually, 60 days, 90 days, 100 days later, what that community would get was a toxic waste incinerator in the middle of their community. Funny part about all that process that we did for 7 or 8 years as a traditional environmental law firm, the funny thing was we had a great win-loss record. You know, it was 100-3. You know, 100 wins in front of administrative law judges and 3 losses. What was fascinating to me was that the liberal progressive community in the United States, they didn't give a shit that the toxic waste incinerator that we had been fighting eventually went into the community, or the 10,000 head hog factory farm eventually went into the community, or wells were being sucked dry by Nestle Corporation coming into communities to take water from those communities. What the liberal progressive community cared about most was the win-loss record that we had on paper as an environmental law firm. So during that period, we got invited to the White House as one of the top 10 environmental law firms in the country. We got the awards, we got the funding, we got the recognition. But none of it was real. Because if you actually set foot in the communities that we were representing to fight these projects off, you would find nothing that looked like what our record did on paper, because eventually the corporations win. And that's the nasty little secret about how the regulatory process is set up, but they win. And so we came, as the Legal Defense Fund, to a point where we almost shut down our office back in the late 1990s. We said to ourselves, we were created to actually protect the natural environment. What we were doing was helping corporations build better permit applications. That's what our law firm was doing. And when we looked out at the landscape at other environmental law firms, guess what? They were doing the same thing. And guess what? That's what they do today. That's what conventional, traditional environmental law is today. And we wonder why we're losing. We wonder why we look out the window and see what we see, right? We wonder why ice floes are breaking off in the Arctic, right? We wonder that. We shouldn't wonder anymore. It's because our activism is so flaccid. It's non-existent because it's been scripted for us. The corporate boys, when they write the regulatory plans, when they write the regulatory regimes, they write them. And for us to think that it devolves any decision-making power on us whatsoever to actually decide what our sustainable community is going to look like, we're on the tip of insanity because we keep doing the same thing over and over again without getting a different result, which is the definition of insanity. So what happens next in this little world of ours? Well, we can continue doing the conventional traditional activism, and we will watch and continue to see the things that we love be destroyed, right? Or we can do something different. The great thing to me, I wake up in the morning wondering why anything's happening at all, right? I'm amazed that anything's actually happening at all because we've been so beaten down. The law is not ours. The constitutional structure is not ours. Corporations have constitutional rights that allow them to have more rights than the communities in which we operate. How did that happen? Well, we've had about 100 years of this stuff happening. People get upset about the Citizens United decision dealing with First Amendment election spending. Well, guess what? It's nothing new. It's nothing new. It's been here for 100 years. So what are people doing in communities when they come up against a toxic waste incinerator? Well, it used to be they were doing the same thing that people were doing for the last 50 years, which is diving into the environmental regulatory process and nothing happening. That changed back in 2000. I don't know why it changed. I still don't know why it changed. We basically follow stuff that happens and then help it get bigger. That's what we do. In the year 2000, a small community called Wells Township in south central Pennsylvania, right up against the Maryland line, population 529, right? Conservative, Republican, not liberal, not progressive, were hit with a series of factory farms coming into their municipality. Factory farms, for folks that don't know what these things are, in Pennsylvania, 10,000, 15,000 hogs jammed into a confinement operation, essentially part of what we call this corporatization of agriculture in the United States. Believe it or not, 4 corporations now control over 70% of pork production in the United States. One company, Kraft, controls over 60% of cheese production in the United States, and 3 corporations control 60% of chicken production in the United States. The way they do that, the production now, and we're in a sprint mode here because I don't want to get the hook over here from, but the way they do production now is essentially we've had hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of decentralized family farmers who have been replaced by a handful of agribusiness corporations in this corporatization of agriculture scheme that's emerged. The farmers who now grow for the corporations don't even own their own animals. So a farmer under contract to a mega corporation to raise animals, the title for the animals is held by the agribusiness corporation. Unless, of course, an animal dies, and then title to the dead animal passes to the farmer for disposal. In addition to that, the large corporations control everything from feeding schedules to vaccination schedules, and essentially control this closed market now, where farmers have become serfs, in essence, to those mega agribusiness corporations. Suicide rates for farmers, suicide among farmers, is now the #1 cause of death for farmers in the United States, surpassing equipment-related deaths as non-natural type of death in the United States. And the reason for that is because a family farm culture is becoming extinct. And so folks who have run a family farm for 6, 7, 10, 15 generations are now losing them to this corporatization of agriculture that's occurring in the marketplace. What happened in Wells Township, population 549? They were faced with a couple large factory farm operations coming in from some of these large mega agribusiness corporations. The environmental lawyers who they went to get help from, which included some of my friends, said to them, well, we're sorry, you can't ban factory farms from coming into your community. Can't ban factory farms. Why can't you ban factory farms? Well, guess what? You can't ban anything. So whether you ask the corporate lawyers and the environmental lawyers, they'll tell you the same thing, which is you have to allow all legal uses within your municipality. It's black letter law in the United States. It may sound strange when you first hear it because people say, well, we have zoning. We can keep things out from zoning. Well, no. You actually have to allow all legal uses into your municipality. You have to put them someplace, and you can't prohibit them outright. So if the city of Seattle said, gee, we don't think big box stores are a really good idea for the city of Seattle, and you pass a 1-paragraph ordinance that says no big box stores within the city of Seattle, the first thing that happens is a lawsuit from Costco or from Walmart who says you've violated our corporate constitutional rights because we have a constitutionally vested interest in being allowed to carry out a legal use within your municipality. What constitutes a legal use? It's anything that's permitted or regulated by the state. Low-level radioactive waste sites, legal use. Corporate pork production, legal use. Waste, commerce, legal use coming into the states from out of states, out-of-state garbage, out-of-state waste. You name it, it's defined as a legal use. Communities are prohibited from banning the legal use. If you act to ban it, what happens next is you get a lawsuit from the corporation to overturn it, but in addition to that, damages in the form of future lost profits, which the municipality can be sued for by the corporation as a result of violating the corporate constitutional rights of that company. So, little town of Wells Township, they say, go to the environmental lawyers, the experts, and they say, what can we do? And the environmental lawyers say, well, you can appeal the permits. And the Wells Township supervisors say, well, wait a minute, if we appeal the permits, that means all we can talk about is manure, because that's all the permits are about. It's how much liquid manure can be spread per acre of land. And they said, that's going to allow it in. And the environmental lawyers said, that's right, because regulating means allowing it in. The verb regulate means to allow it in so you can control the flow of it. That's what regulating means. And the folks in Wells Township said, well, that's bullshit. They said it a number of times, including my presence when I got called in. They said, well, that's bullshit. We have, we govern our own community here. We have a democracy in the United States. And God damn it, we're going to exercise that democracy here in Wells Township. And we said, fine, what are you going to do? And they said, we're going to ban corporate farming within this municipality. We're going to ban the ability of these agribusiness corporations to actually farm, to engage in farming, and to have these output contracts, these farming contracts within our municipality. And we told them, well, you can do that, But the structure of law that's set up in the United States means that the hammer comes down on you when you attempt to actually prohibit something in the interests of building sustainability within that community. And what comes down on you is a series of different legal doctrines that have been manufactured over the past 120 years to protect certain property interests over democracy interests in a municipality. In essence, those doctrines create a system in which corporations have more rights than the community majority in which they're doing business. That always sounds strange to say, but that's the situation that we have in the United States today. The Wells Township supervisors fired their environmental lawyers. They said, we have no interest in going through the regulatory system because we have no interest in allowing these folks to come in. And some of the supervisors were also farmers. They understood this true big frame of the problem about this corporatization of ag. They then hired us. And we were at a point where we thought it was bullshit too, that municipalities weren't able to do this and that there was a system of law that kept them in that box. And so we assisted them to draft the first in Pennsylvania municipal ordinance that banned corporations from farming within the municipality, right? Banned corporate factory farming in the municipality. Funny things started to happen. When I had private conversations with these Wells Township folks, I said, well, you know why you can't do it? And they said, sure, but if we do it, maybe someone else will do it too. And then maybe someone else will do it in addition to them. And then maybe someone else, and then maybe it'll spread over here and spread over here. And sure as shit, that's what happened. It went from Wells Township all the way into the rest of Fulton County, so several municipalities there, then up to north central Pennsylvania, out to western Pennsylvania, and out to eastern Pennsylvania. It's fascinating to watch. Basically, people acting unconstitutionally and illegally in the open, right? Directly confronting an illegitimate system of law, which is something that our activism has steered clear of because it's afraid to do it. It's afraid to confront those structural constraints directly. In addition to the corporate factory farm issue in Pennsylvania, something else started to happen. And this dealt with sewage sludge. It's a good thing it's after dinner and not before. For anybody who doesn't know what sewage sludge is, it's everything that goes down the toilet or down the drain in an area that's hooked up to a centralized sewage treatment system. We used to take the sludge and dump it off the coast of New Jersey. Some people who have been in that area of New Jersey probably think that's a good idea to dump it off the coast. What happened was it created a dead zone off the coast of New Jersey, killing all the life because guess what? When you dump the stuff into the ocean, that's what it does. The brain surgeons that gave us ocean dumping of sludge came up with something called land-applied sewage sludge. And then they legalized it through a federal regulatory system administered by the EPA. Today, 60% of all sludge, that's the stuff coming out of the toilets and the hospitals and some therapeutic waste and all kinds of stuff, actually goes into the waste stream and is applied to farmland where we grow our food. Not just for human consumption, but also for livestock consumption. Pennsylvania, some people were upset about sewage sludge being put on land next to their houses. Because guess what? Philadelphia sewage sludge doesn't get put on land near the multi-million McMansions right outside of Philadelphia. It's actually shipped into the rural part of PA where a lot of stuff gets dumped because it's rural, not populated, and very little political power in the legislature to stop it for those communities. Those communities came to us and said, well, we need help too. We've seen what you're doing with the factory farm stuff and keeping corporate farms out. We want to keep corporations from sludging us. And it turns out 4 corporations control 60% of the sludge market in the United States as well. And so these communities came to us to get us to draft an ordinance. We drafted an anti-corporate sludging ordinance, which was then passed not by 5 or 10 or 20, but by 80 municipalities in Pennsylvania. We have about 1,200 rural municipalities, just to give you an idea. And keep in mind, these were being combined now with the factory farm ordinances. About 100 different communities across the state of Pennsylvania had started to put up their middle finger to the factory farm corporations and to the sludge corporations and to the legislature for enabling those corporations to do what they do within those communities. What happened next was the state intervening. The state legislature stepped in and drafted a bill called ACRE. And what did ACRE do? ACRE authorized the state attorney general's office to sue the municipal governments to overturn the ordinances that they were passing to keep the sludge and factory farm corporations out. Now, some of you might think, if we live in a democracy, wouldn't it be wonderful if the state actually intervened on the side of the communities once in a while, rather than intervening on the side of the corporations that were attempting to use the communities for what they want to do. At about this time, one of our communities also got sued by an agribusiness corporation. who came in saying that your anti-corporate farming law violates our corporation's right under the Constitution, so corporate constitutional rights. In the United States today, corporations have the same rights as you or I. Walmart has First Amendment rights, Fourth Amendment rights against unreasonable search and seizure, Fifth Amendment due process rights, 14th Amendment equal protection and due process rights. They have the same Bill of Rights protections as you as a result of rulings back in the 1840s and the 1860s and the 1880s giving corporations Bill of Rights protections from the U.S. Constitution. Okay? So, in Pennsylvania, with this lawsuit that was filed, the corporation said, number one, you violated our corporate rights and you owe us damages. Right? We're going to sue you for damages. Number two, you violated Dillon's rule. Dillon's rule is this concept that municipal governments are in a relationship of a parent-child to the state. That the state government is the parent, the municipality is the child, and the child can't do anything unless explicitly authorized by the state. The argument being that banning corporate factory farms and corporate sludging was not a power given to the municipality by the state legislature, and therefore under Dillon's rule that the ordinance needed to be overturned. And finally, there's the third horseman of the three horsemen, which is preemption, which is corporations routinely use our state legislatures to outright preempt municipalities from passing stricter environmental standards than the state has passed. What was fascinating about that lawsuit, because it was framed differently, it wasn't a community trying to regulate manure from a factory farm facility. It was a community saying no to corporate factory farms right off the bat, a prohibition. That other communities who thought that we live in a democracy as well began actually watching the legal system and the legislature dominating these municipalities who were standing up for their right to local self-government to say, we don't want this kind of unsustainable agriculture within our community. And fascinating enough, at the same time that folks were starting to explore this corporate rights, community rights, the need for structural change stuff, they started talking about something called rights of nature. This concept that under our system of law, nature is property. Ecosystems are property. If you own a 10-acre piece of land within the United States, it carries with it the right to destroy the ecosystems on that piece of property. That's the environmental protection system that we have today. It's led a lot of people to say that we've never had an environmental movement in the United States, because the environmental movement that we have has been based on a property ownership type of concept and structure for environmental protection, not on a rights-based structure of environmental protection. And so coming out of these rural Republican conservative communities, they began writing ordinances creating ecosystem rights. There are 36 of them now in the United States, Maine, New Hampshire, Virginia, and Pennsylvania, in which the communities have declared that nature is not property within those municipalities. That ecosystems have legally enforceable rights within the municipality that the residents themselves can defend and enforce. And those 36 communities in the United States eventually bled over into the country of Ecuador, where we were invited down to talk about rights of nature. They actually became the first country to write rights of ecosystems into their national constitution, which was ratified in 2008, becoming the first country to switch from a property-based environmental protection system to a rights-based protection system. So, where does all this leave us? Well, there's a lot of stuff that's been done in Pennsylvania. It's a revolt. I mean, what's happening in Pennsylvania right now is a full-scale revolt. It's almost collective nonviolent civil disobedience, where folks are not just moving forward individually to lay in front of the bulldozers and then the full force of the criminal state comes down to arrest them and throw them into jail. It's that communities are beginning to seize their municipal governments, to turn them up against the state and federal government, to in essence build legal structures for sustainability. It sounds really strange to me to say this, and first time I heard of it, it made my brain go a little wacky too, but the current situation of the law in the United States is that sustainability is illegal. Sustainability is illegal because sustainability itself is prevented from being attained by a structure of legal rights that protects property and commerce over the rights of communities, nature, and people. That's in essence the constitutional structure that we have. What I think we're seeing in the United States today, because this work has spread out to Maine and New Hampshire, it's spread out to Spokane, it's beginning to take sprout here in Seattle, is that we're looking at a new civil rights movement. And it's one that redefines community. It's not just the people in the community, but also the ecosystems and nature itself within those communities. It has resulted in about 140 new ordinances. And we think that those ordinances that have been passed in these communities as legally binding ordinances are essentially the blueprints for new constitutional structures in the United States. That what we're seeing is a constitutional rights movement. Just last year, communities in Pennsylvania joined together to talk about a state constitutional convention to begin changing the state constitution to parallel and align what's happening in these local communities. What's arising in these communities now as a next evolution of this work are these Bill of Rights. That communities are beginning to pass local bills of rights that have the effect of banning and prohibiting those activities which would violate the Bill of Rights within those communities. And part of that is actually limiting rights for corporations. We have about 50 communities now that have stripped corporations of constitutional protections within their municipalities. And it's all part of a learning and evolution process to say to ourselves that our activism is stunted because we assume that those legal doctrines are going to be around forever, and we work around them. It's what prior people's movements didn't do. Separate but equal was a legal doctrine. People didn't work around it, they took aim frontally at it. The abolitionists, African Americans, were property at one point. Killing a slave was a property crime. Damages were paid to the slave owner. The slave had no rights under the system of law. With suffragists, rape was a property crime. It was damages paid to the husband. There were no rights that are accrued to the woman. A rights-based activism means actually driving ecosystems and nature and our communities, which are currently treated as property of the state, into being rights-bearing entities. I have to say that I don't see a shortcut to that. It's a long march, but it's starting to happen. In November of last year, the city of Pittsburgh became the first major municipality to strip natural gas corporations of constitutional rights within their municipality, to ban natural gas fracking, and to recognize that ecosystems within the city of Pittsburgh were not property anymore, that they were rights-bearing within the city of Pittsburgh. And now they're playing around with a test case to protect the Monongahela River from fracking chemicals that are being injected upstream, which actually damage the river when it runs through the city of Pittsburgh. I think what we're seeing again are the beginnings of a community constitutional revolt. And it's beginning to take hold in Washington State. Just to finish out with two quick things. One is Spokane, where in 2008, a community coalition of 24 groups, labor unions, environmental organizations, and community groups came together to begin drafting a new community Bill of Rights for the city of Spokane. Those 24 groups eventually qualified it for the ballot. It went on the ballot in 2009. It lost big. It had a bunch of things in it, everything from healthcare to housing to environmental protection to corporate rights, all that kind of stuff. The group then reformed and has now requalified a new ballot initiative for 2011, which contains 4 core rights. Number 1, that neighborhoods have the right to deny zoning changes for development corporations that want to come into their neighborhoods. Number 2, that the Spokane River and Spokane Aquifer have certain rights, legally enforceable ecosystem rights of their own. Third, that employees have constitutional rights in the workplace. Another nasty little fact in the United States is that when you cross the threshold into your private employer, you're automatically stripped of your constitutional rights, your Bill of Rights protections. And number 4, that corporate rights, when they come into conflict with the Bill of Rights within the city of Spokane, will be subordinated to those community rights. And that's what the Community Bill of Rights campaign is this year in the city of Spokane. There's a nascent effort underway here in Seattle called Envision Seattle. A guy named Jeff Reifman, who organized some democracy schools in the city of Spokane, is pursuing putting together a community Bill of Rights perhaps for the city of Seattle. We've also drafted an ordinance that would be the first municipal ordinance in the United States to guarantee net neutrality within the city of Seattle. Right now the net neutrality stuff is being fought out at the federal level. It's diluted. It's not very effective. The question is, can we move this organizing into a municipal level and drive things like net neutrality forward? So, in doing the Martin Luther King Jr. Speech, I thought it would bring a smile to his face when we decided to actually call this work Collective Municipal Nonviolent Civil Disobedience. That our civil disobedience has to become collective, because if it doesn't, we're pretty screwed, and communities will get fried. And that's the legacy here, is to create a new civil rights movement that finishes the work that all these folks that came before us started. Thank you.
Basic precautionary principles never seem to be applied to industrial chemicals, whereas we do with the drugs that we take. At least we have the FDA to try to prevent some of that. So why not? And how can we change that?
That's a great question. And I think just to let people know, the situation with chemicals is very different than the situation with drugs. Drugs have to be I was going to say heavily. They have to be tested for safety. Chemicals essentially do not, particularly if they are chemicals that have been around for a while, that predated the Toxic Substances Control Act of 1976, which is a lot of chemicals that are out there. They don't have to be tested unless there is some suspicion that they may cause harm. Well, if you don't test them, how do you know that there's a suspicion that they may cause harm? So it's kind of a vicious cycle. You can't do the testing. You don't have to. Companies don't have to do the testing unless they think there's going to be harm, but they're not going to find out if there's harm unless they do testing, right? So it's kind of a catch-22. So very few of the chemicals that are in common use in this country have actually been tested. I forget what the figures are. It depends on the category of chemical, but for commercial chemicals, it's like 80% have not been tested. It's an astounding percentage for cosmetics. It's, I think, slightly higher percentage is tested, but for many chemicals on the market in this country today have not received sufficient, adequate toxicological testing to know if they're safe or not. Why is that so? It's so because of the Toxic Substances Control Act that has not been updated since 1976. It's the only piece of environmental legislation in this country that was passed in the 70s that has not yet been updated. There's been a major attempt to update it last year with the Obama administration. It was one of the things that was taken on by the environmental community, and it didn't get very far. It lost when the House and the Senate changed. Well, when the House changed in the elections last year. So we are still living with the old Toxic Substances Control Act, and that's what it would take. Would be a major revision to that act. Is that likely at this point? Quite frankly, I would say probably not, because we just don't seem to have the will to be able to do it, because, as Thomas points out, the legal structures are set up by the corporations. The laws are written largely by the corporations, by the corporate lawyers. So it's very unlikely that we would get a really effective, strong system in this country, particularly now. I'm not without hope, though. We have seen the precautionary principle come in various shapes and forms in the country. Certainly, the proposal that there was to revise the Toxic Substances Control Act last year was much better and did contain, if not the precautionary principle, then certainly it required some testing requirements. It was much better, but as I say, it didn't get very far through the House when the House changed hands in November.
Okay, here's a question for both of you, in that a lot of the movements that we've talked about in history and even up to modern times has taken 2 to 3 generations, if not more, that you almost have to wait for a certain type of personality to die off before you can accomplish that change. Do we have time for that?
Do we have time not to start it? I mean, is that a luxury that we have? I mean, that becomes the issue. And the movements, real movements that grow, take time. We forget that the organized abolitionist movement took 80 years. It took 80 years for the organized abolitionist movement to drive the radical Republicans into office and then drive the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendments into the Constitution. The suffragists, from an organized perspective, took 110. 110 years to make equal protection real. And in fact, that was just suffrage. That wasn't making equal protection real, because the ERA never made it through. But the fact is, we have lots to learn from those movements about how they emerged on the scene, how they congealed. I mean, the abolitionist movement started as 12 kids at Oberlin College under Ted Weld, who is probably a famous abolitionist that nobody's ever heard about. So 12 kids got together and had a conference. They were expelled from Lane Seminary in Cincinnati, Ohio. They moved to Oberlin College. They became the abolitionist movement. So 12 kids eventually drove the amendments into the Constitution to do, grant rights to vote as well as abolish slavery in the United States. And so from simple beginnings, they moved. But the real question is, can we continue doing what we're doing and expect a different result? And what if people 20 years ago had actually started doing some of the real structural work? Where would we be today?
I don't think we can afford not to act. I mean, what kind of a world do we want to leave for our kids and our grandkids and their children? We cannot afford not to act. Yes, it may take time, but nothing that's really worth working for comes easy. And I think we need to take a long-term view and just not expect to achieve, if we really invest ourselves in the process of doing the work, not expect victory overnight, and maybe we'll be surprised. I think what's happening on Wall Street and across the country right now is a very powerful sign of the dissatisfaction and the anger and the frustration that people are feeling in this country right now. And we haven't seen, I think it's a very, very positive sign that what we're seeing, that people are rising up spontaneously, and it will bring about change.
And just to add to that, I think it's the imminency that's not felt by a lot of people. There's a crisis that's not felt by a lot of people. We had a meeting this past week with the Vice President of the Maldives Islands. The Maldives is a country that's the lowest lying country in the world, and some of their landmass is 6 inches above sea level. They're going to be underwater by the year 2015. By current estimates. And so what are they doing? Well, they're buying land in India to move their 300,000 people to India. I mean, it's that imminency of this stuff. And going back to something that Kate said that resonated with me about the environmental groups was that they were founded by folks who already had some rights. They weren't founded by folks who were from the outside looking in, but actually attempting to enforce or create rights that they felt that they already had.
Well, that actually segues into another question we have on Twitter, and we'd like both of you to, is can you address the Occupy Wall Street movement in light of this topic? What are some of its potential implications?
I'm waiting for that kind of stuff to happen, and I'm glad that it's happening. Unfortunately, in this country, we've pretty much given up hope that government's going to do anything for us, that the companies are going to do anything for us, that anybody higher up is going to do anything for us. And so we finally get to this breaking point where people say, okay, I've given up on everything else. I'm going to sit on this corner, and I'm going to say I'm here, and I need to be heard. And collectively, we need to be heard. But it tends not to be focused on structural change or constraints that operate within the system. It's more about individual single issue stuff. And what I think is happening right now in the seminal days of this kind of stuff is that people are getting trained. It's like the Clamshell Alliance in the early anti-nuke days, where people do these demonstrations, and through the demonstrations they're beginning to train themselves in methods of civil disobedience. And hopefully true movements take those seeds and then they build it into something real. And that something real begins to be something that takes aim at structural constraints, which we've had a real lack of movements in the last 100 years that have taken aim at structural constraints and asked the real question is, why is it the default in the law in the United States today that it's legal to be toxically trespassed upon? Why is that the default of the law? Why do we have to always change it to actually be respectful of rights? And so it's those kinds of constraints that have to be overturned.
When I was growing up in England in the late 1960s, I can remember seeing on TV, the marches, the mid-60s, the anti-Vietnam War marches. I can remember seeing the Kent State, thank you, protests. I can remember seeing that stuff on TV. And since then, there's really been I think the nature of social change movements has really, since the 60s and the early 70s, has changed. It's been very hard to get boots on the street in the US since those days. I mean, yes, there have been some big marches, but by and large, those days of the 60s and 70s, those mass march days, seem to me to have passed. And then you look at what has continued to happen in Europe with mass marches in Europe on all sorts of things. You look at the Arab Spring and what's happened in those countries that have changed dictatorships in a matter of months. Why in the US? And I say this as a non-US citizen. But I do pay taxes here. Why are folks, so I have taxation without representation. Why are we so accepting? Why are we so passive? Why are we not on the streets? You know, why are we sitting here in town hall tonight having a very comfortable conversation? Why are we not out there on the streets at Westlake or wherever they were today? Why are we not expressing our anger? People are angry. I see it in my classrooms all the time. My students are very angry, are very frustrated with those political constructs. They may not have the language that Thomas does, but they know what they're talking about. Their anger is there, but instead of expressing it and getting out there on the streets, I think US society, and perhaps I'm being judgmental here, has become very passive and very accepting. And I think the Wall Street demonstrations that we're seeing now they're like music to my ears.
And I think one of the reasons why you have that situation is that everything's so camouflaged. In other words, our constituency are the folks in the community that have a factory farm going in next door to them. And so their brains are being opened because they say, well, what do you mean we can't say no? What do you mean we can't say no to this type of agriculture in our communities? And what do you mean corporations have rights? I mean, where does that come from? You know, and it's when they start asking the why. Well, why is that? Well, why do corporations have rights? Well, it's because the U.S. Supreme Court said so. Well, why did the Supreme Court say so? Well, it's because we have a constitutional structure that essentially was written in the 1780s when the Founding Fathers said we have unlimited natural resources that we have to exploit. Because to become a great country, you exploit your natural resources. And so they wrote a plan to enable that to happen, and it's worked very well. But it's not a plan of governance to take us into the next 100 years. It's not a sustainability plan of governance. It's something else. And right now it whacks us at every turn. And that's even with the people who understand how the system works and who see through the camouflage. And I think a lot of our work today is about rendering the invisible visible. Because it's this disconnect that Kate talked about, you know, between the two. You're setting up the two poles and then using those poles to build a social movement. And we have to be very careful that we set the poles as far apart as possible to actually reflect the true situation. Otherwise, we ask for remedies that do not change the structure itself, which is as dangerous as doing nothing in some ways, because you're solving a false problem at that point.
And in fact, that hits another question we had, is talking about making the invisible visible. That's a big part of the process. People are mad at Bank of America right now because of they all of a sudden are seeing where their fees are coming from. So you're looking at municipalities. Are there other areas that maybe individuals themselves can empower themselves to make the invisible visible in ways that would be beneficial?
Yeah, well, for us it all starts with people actually learning how the law works. And what the law is that they live under. Because until that happens, you can't take it a step further to do it collectively. And so in democracy schools, I mean, we go through 2 days of this stuff. We actually unwrap all these laws. We go back to 1066 and look at English common law. Because believe it or not, the structure that we have in the United States today is in essence something called English common law, which floated over from the Norman invasion of England, which is some of the worst law that was ever created in the world. But it was actually, we adopted it because the Founding Fathers who sat in Constitutional Hall were mostly lawyers, and they thought English law was the best thing since sliced bread. And so they replicated it. And so the point is that learning that stuff is a big first step. But I guess I'm really tired of people seeing education as the final step. There are groups that are set up that you'll say, what do you do? And they'll say, well, we educate people. All right. Well, people have to come along, and education is such a dominant, subordinate concept in the first place. But you got to learn what the system is before you dismantle it. But dismantling has to be the second step. So it does no good just to have educated people as long as that's not resulting in action. And so the democracy schools are a part of, hey, this is how it actually works, believe it or not. And then, hey, if you want to change it, it means joining together with other people who have also brought themselves to a point where they understand what's happening, and then seizing their municipal apparatus. And it always sounds so easy to do, but it's not. And it's very difficult to do because every level is built against you, but it's something that has to happen. And
I want to remind everybody that we do have a mic up here in front if you'd like to stand up and ask a question. One from Kate, and this actually gets back to one of the very first seminar series we had talking about feminizing hormones. We had a presentation talking about BPA almost 10 years ago now. And we're still dealing with trying to get that regulated in the United States, even though we have a tremendous amount of information about it. So, the question gets down to how do we move forward on something like that where we actually have a lot of information? Where do we start making the attack? Where do you start pushing? Where do you start? Do you do it at the state level? Do you do it at the federal level? Do you do it at the local level? What's the best place to attack?
Well, I have to confess I am not a big fan of single chemical regulation. We have about 80,000 chemicals out there. If we want to regulate each one separately, we're going to be around doing it for a very, very, very long time. So my first response is I'm not a fan of regulating things one chemical at a time. We need a much more comprehensive approach, a much more systematic approach that looks at the very least, whole families of chemicals, at the very least, whole classes of chemicals, and make decisions based on the precautionary principle. So I do believe the way forward is massive toxic chemical policy reform, and even before that, because as I've said, the prospects for that are not really bright right now. We can do what we can through not using products that have BPA in them. It may be a small step. I totally agree. It's a small step, but at least it's something. At least it's something that we can do. But fundamentally, we need to look at the way we are producing and using these substances in our whole society and how our industrial production system is structured around producing them and using them, and change it. There's also a very positive movement right now on green chemistry, and we've had at least one seminar, if not more, on the green chemistry movement here, and looking at what we can do instead of using toxic chemicals. So we don't have to wait for policy reform.
Okay. And this is for Thomas. We've got a lot of the corporations today aren't American corporations. They're foreign-based, foreign-owned. So how do we entertain any kind of accountability to those organizations in which we have no even federal holdover?
Well, you prohibit them from doing business in your municipality. And if they're protected by NAFTA or GATT, which is the international trade agreements, and what's fascinating about the international trade agreements is that they're our commerce clause. There's a thing in the U.S. Constitution called a commerce clause, which essentially preempts municipalities from dealing with anything that involves interstate commerce. Our lawyers perfected the commerce clause to strip municipalities of governing authority in the United States, and then they exported it out into the NAFTA and GATT international trade agreements, which are now used to overturn even federal legislation or state legislation. And so some communities in Maine are now talking about nullifying NAFTA and GATT within their municipality, declaring that they will be GATT-free or NAFTA-free. And at some point, I think that frontal disobedience has to start, and it actually has to be like the body eating itself, which is municipalities rising up against the state and federal level. Because I got to be honest, most of the communities that we work with, they've given up on the federal government or the state government doing anything to help them. And going back to Derek Jensen, who writes a lot of this stuff, he says it's time to give up hope that somebody's going to intervene, like the Sierra Club is going to help you out, or the federal government is going to help you out, or some agency is going to help you out, or Jesus Christ is going to help you out, or some kind of Tinkerbell is going to come in to help you out, because it's all the same thing, which is fantasy. And that when people begin to give up hope and say the only thing that's going to stop this is us acting, it's when the hope overcomes the fear being the acting. And the fact is that if you don't act, sometimes there's more damage caused than if you do act. And so I think it's the community's moving forward in that way. But whatever happened to a self-governing people? I mean, we read the Declaration of Independence tonight, and we teach it in democracy school. It was like this whole new vision of governance, of the people, for the people, by the people. What the hell ever happened to that? And maybe we need a tea party of a different kind, which is one actually that injects sanity into our governing systems and stops a corporate minority from making decisions that override community majorities. Because I got to say, that wasn't the kind of democracy I learned when I was in kindergarten. That's not the way it works.
Yes.
I connect and feel what both of you are saying. What can I do as an individual to actually participate?
Where do you live? Let's do it. There's a training session tomorrow at 6:30. And the email address is jeff@envisionseattle.org. Come. Speak. Yes. Yes.
That's great. That's actually, I personally think we can accelerate some of the length of time that normally takes the 80 years, the generations, because we have tools to move that information faster so you can get it to people faster. So potentially we can move things a little more rapidly if we take advantage of those sorts of ideas.
Yeah, just to add one more short... Oh.
No, it's okay.
Yeah.
I have the mic too far away, right?
I'm talking a lot, but just to add one more short thing to that is that the other day I was walking in downtown Spokane, and a friend of ours walked out of a building, and she looked really tired. She looked really haggard, and I said, I won't use her real name. I said, Sue, you look really tired. And she goes, yeah, I just organized 900 people via Facebook. And I'm like, well, the Facebook stuff and the Twitter stuff, it's all great for getting people together. But actually organizing is face-to-face. It's face-to-face, it's personal, it's individual, it's all those things, because it's building those trust bonds. And the social media stuff is not organizing. I mean, at least in my mind. It serves a role to get people together, but once together, you got to build those bonds, because otherwise it just doesn't have the heft that it needs to take it the distance.
Thanks.
In defense of the Sierra Club, in all due respect, we are far from perfect. I'm an active member, but we are doing rights-based organizing in several places. We've stopped 4 water bottling plants in the region, 3 at the base of Mount Rainier, 1 in Everett, and we're working on 1 in Anacortes. And we are organizing in the community, and we are working to stop coal trains and many things, and we know what you're talking about with the regulatory commission or agencies, but the Sierra Club has done a lot of good, and we continue to do a lot of good. So I don't want people to drop out of the Sierra Club tonight.
No, please don't. Please don't.
No, and in fact, the folks that I find the folks most aligned with this kind of work are the local chapters. It's not the national. I mean, I remember litigating on behalf of the national chapter, and I had to get permission from 6 different departments to actually sign my name to something, and I was thinking how bureaucratic this whole thing is. There are a lot of local chapters that way. Unfortunately, and in Spokane, the local chapter of the Sierra Club has endorsed the Community Bill of Rights. But in general, when we're talking about the national environmental groups, where I still have many peers and friends, I will not spend another 10 minutes in a room with folks from the national organizations anymore, because I think it's a fundamental waste of time, because they are not the ones that are actually going to do this work. The folks that are going to do this work are the impacted communities. It's the folks who are actually feeling this stuff at home. And that's just my bias after 15 years of doing this work, but that's where I sit.
I just really like to support what Thomas just said. I mean, that is totally my experience too. The environmental justice movement is primarily a local movement. It's a movement of local groups taking action on local issues. They don't want to reform policy. They don't want to change regulations. What they want to do is to stop something. They want to stop the expansion of a hazardous waste site. They want to stop the construction of a facility. They want to... It's generally it is much more a rights-based approach that happens at the local level.
And it's a good example of exactly that is in the 70s, groups coming out of Kentucky wanted to ban strip mining. So they had this very large, sophisticated movement to get the Carter administration to ban strip mining. What happened next was that the national environmental groups came in and actually undermined the effort by regulating strip mining. They said, oh, no, you don't need to ban it. We'll just regulate it to make it safe. And what resulted was the surface mining reclamation laws, which actually allowed it and attempted to regulate it. And it's under that regulation stuff that you get mountaintop removal mining in West Virginia, where they blow mountains tops off. I don't know if people have seen this, but 400 mountains have had their tops blown off. So, when people tell me, well, environmental regulatory laws, this and that, and you guys are full of shit because you talk about how bad they are, go to West Virginia.
Yeah.
Go to West Virginia and look at the moonscape. That used to be a functioning mountain ecosystem in West Virginia, where now, to get at the coal, they blow the tops off the mountains. And the best thing that a lot of the major environmental groups there have done is talk about don't put the refuse after you blow off the top of the mountain into the streams, because you're violating the Clean Water Act at that point. So the coal companies say, okay, we'll put our refuse someplace else, but they continue to blow the tops off the mountains. I said it one more time. The tops off the mountains. They blow the tops off the mountains. And that's what environmental law is today. It's about enabling those activities to take place and trying to get them to cause a little less harm. And I used to not say that so bluntly, but now I'm to a point where I do. So.
Okay, we've got a Twitter question, which is kind of provocative, but I think it'd be fun to see what your answers are. Is it a good idea to dismantle the EPA and start over?
I don't know. It's just a good question. Does the EPA cause more harm than it helps? I don't know. I think it would be great to have an agency devoted to nature's rights. And in fact, just to show how far behind the U.S. is, in Ecuador, just last month, a judge ruled in favor of a river over a construction company that was putting in a road that was damaging the river, using the rights of nature constitutional provisions that are now in the Ecuadorian constitution. They are now setting up an ombudsman at the federal level to actually try claims brought in the name of the ecosystem. So this one case that was heard was the Vilhambra River versus the XXX construction company. It's actually a different way of looking at environmental protection. I wish we had a federal agency that was devoted just to that. Unfortunately, we have to fly 14 hours south to even be in a country that's willing to put something like that into place. So I think a transformation of these things is what has to happen.
I'd like to take a go at that one. I'm not sure either, but what I will tell you is what I'd like to see is I would like to see environmental health taken out from EPA responsibility. When EPA was set up in 1970, it was made responsible for environmental health as well as the health of the environment, right? So what that meant was that all of the folks who had been working on public health measures to protect the environment ended up in EPA along with the engineers who were there to essentially try and do something about the toxic waste sites, because EPA was, at that time, a lot of its work was around in the 70s was around toxic waste sites. So you get all of these folks coming from essentially from the public health movement who'd spent almost 100 years working on what were called sanitation measures, so safe drinking water, sewage systems, all of those things that give us good public health were put into EPA with all of the cleanup engineers. And what that did was it took away the preventive focus that these folks had, the public health people had had for over 100 years, and EPA has never really had a strong mandate to prevent harm to public health. It's always been about doing something after there has been damage to human health. So I would love to see the whole environmental health mandate get taken out from EPA and put back into Health and Human Services in the public health service, and that's where it is in a lot of other Western countries. Responsibility for environmental health is in with the health departments. It's not in with the environmental agencies. It's a separate responsibility. Yes, they need to be linked, but we need to protect human health.
You got a question?
Quick comment on that comment, Kate. That we still struggle with that with Washington State. We have a Department of Health that's not very effective, and we depend on the Department of Ecology to move a lot of our rules forward. And a comment on just the state versus federal stuff. A few years ago, Washington State passed a law banning lead, cadmium, and phthalates in baby toys. And what happened? What did industry do? They went to the feds, preempted the law, weakened it for their Commerce Clause, and then gave the Consumer Product Safety Commission the rights to gut the law. So what the hell do we do about that when we pass good legislation at the state level and then see it ripped apart at the federal level?
Well, we need to ask why that happened and what stuff in the structure allows that to happen. And so that means taking on preemption frontally, which is this, a lot of lawyers say that's crazy. You can't take preemption on frontally. It's one of the basic building blocks of how our system is built. Well, how crazy is preemption? You put decision-making in a smaller number of hands further away from the community that's impacted, and then give those folks the ability to preempt the municipality or the state that's passed something in the first place. If we want to stop this stuff from happening, we have to actually analyze the problem, find out what the structural constraints are that allow it and enable it to happen, and then work to overturn those through the municipal level by building upwards. I wish I had a different answer for those types of situations. But look at the Commerce Clause. Commerce Clause is a great example. It's privately enforceable, which means it doesn't require the federal government to come in and enforce the Commerce Clause, even part of the Constitution. It's privately enforceable by the corporations. And that's why you have Waste Management suing the state of Virginia to overturn its out-of-state waste ban, saying that garbage is commerce, therefore only Congress can legislate it. And guess what? We're a private corporation. We're coming in to enforce it. And preemption is the same way. The governments don't have to enforce their preemptive laws. The corporations do it because it's privately enforceable. So until we fix this stuff, it would be easy to drift back and say, let's deal with it at the end. But the problem is it's like an iceberg. You see 20% of it up top, but 80% of it's underneath. And it's accumulated from generation to generation. So at some point we got to start from scratch because what we have is not working.
Linda?
So I have a question about essentially community-based activism, and I was really struck by your example of sort of Pennsylvaniaville, 590, really rural, spreading to other rural communities, and a lot coming from that. Versus here, we've got a city of huge, and communities. The whole city is not a community in a sense. It's a compilation of many little communities. So I'm just really curious. What both of you would have to say about the change coming from these small rural or smaller towns where people really know each other versus the larger cities where in theory you could have a little bit like steamroll into a lot, but people don't all know each other. So I would just be curious about what you'd have to say about that.
It's an excellent question. One that we had to confront when we went to Spokane. We were invited into Spokane to help out these 24 groups because we had never worked in a city. And so what we had was municipalities, relatively small, 5,000 to 10,000, somewhere is basically the range of who we work with, that were confronting a common threat from a common enemy. So it was Walmart coming in, or it was a factory farm corporation coming in. It was one corporation. And so the organizing was pretty straightforward. It was black and white. It was straightforward. And there were very few benefiting from the activity of the corporation in the municipality, so you were able to build up a critical mass to confront it. In Spokane, what was fascinating to me is the revolt was led by neighborhoods in Spokane. We have 27 neighborhoods in the city of Spokane. And what would happen would be that a condominium development or something that somebody didn't want, like a big box store in the South Hill neighborhood, which is in the southern part of Spokane, that the Walmart wanted to come in. The neighborhood said, we don't want it. But under the law, the neighborhood has no authority to say no. So they're in the same position as our municipalities. So the neighborhood versus the city is the same as municipalities versus the state. And that was the string that started to pull, because some neighborhoods said, well, wait a minute, what do you mean as a neighborhood we don't have authority to say yes or no to development coming in? And then the labor folks who are working across the city started talking about workplaces, and people started saying, what do you mean I don't have rights in the workplace? And so this Bill of Rights stuff, rather than a specific ordinance aimed at anti-corporate farming, that's something broader like a Bill of Rights that actually united different interest groups from different parts of the city, so that you had folks from the Sierra Club sitting across from the laborers or the iron workers, something that hasn't happened in the last 5 years, let alone the last 100, is to have them in the same room voting unanimously to support a rights of nature provision in the local Bill of Rights. I mean, it's kind of crazy stuff happening. But it's about finding those interests and then uniting them in something that can drive forward. Because the labor folks said, we can't do it on our own, we need support from others. And so they joined hands with the neighborhood activists and the community groups to actually drive something forward. I think in Seattle it's much more complicated because you're much larger. But at the same time, there are interests that are driving people every day. I mean, we've done 5 democracy schools here, and people have this laundry list of issues that they're working on at the state and federal level, to which we say localize them, because you're wasting your time because the state and federal level is never going to do X, Y, and Z. And so I think here there's an opportunity here. Whether people exercise that opportunity or not is a whole other question.
Kate, do you have anything to say?
I do. I think it absolutely has to start at the community level. And you won't be surprised to hear me say that, Linda, after all the conversations we've had over the years on this. But it has to start at the community level. And why is that? Because people will protect what they care for. People will protect what they care for. And we care for our neighborhoods. We care for our homes. We care for the streets we live on. We care for the communities that we live in. And something like the big city of Seattle, even if we work in it every day, is like, it's not really something that many people actually care about. So it has to start at the community level because those are the places we care about.
Okay, let's take these last 3 questions. If we've got 3 people in line, I'm assuming you. Oh, 4. Okay, last 4 questions.
A question for Thomas. You said that there were something like 140 ordinances that have been passed nationally so far. And I'm just wondering what the legal battles are around those. I understand that very few have been challenged so far, even though some of them are many years old. And I just wondered if you could lay out in some detail why they're difficult to challenge and why they're not being challenged and what's coming.
Well, what just happened yesterday was a perfect example of how the corporate boys learn as this stuff evolves, which is now they're trying to stop communities from being even able to put stuff on the ballot. So, we were passing it 2 ways, city councils passing stuff and people putting stuff on ballots and then passing it. The corporate boys are now trying to get the municipalities, like the fracking companies in western Pennsylvania, are now using the municipal officials to try to sue to keep stuff off the ballot before it even gets passed. And so they're starting to work backwards in the system. There's been a couple challenges to ordinances that have been adopted. The funny part about the challenges is that as conventional environmental organizers and activists, sometimes we hide in the closet hoping that somebody doesn't sue us. These ordinances, when they're passed by municipalities, are only valuable if they're sued over. Because it's the lawsuit itself which actually begins to tear the blinders away from folks. The lawsuit actually has to come. The ordinances actually incorporate the challenge. They hope that it comes. And the reason for that is that if you have an ordinance sitting there, people think, hey, we have a democracy, we passed an ordinance, this stuff is now working in the community. And that's great, because that's one step towards it. But you need them to be challenged, whether they're challenged by federal regulators, whether they're challenged by the corporations. Because when the corporations come in and say, you can't have that law. You can't build the community you want. You don't have the authority to build the community you want. That's when the fun starts. Because then people start to see in clumps that we actually don't live under the system that they thought that we lived under. And that's when the real education kicks into being, is when those challenges are brought. So it's like the abolition of the suffragists. The suffragists ran 980 different campaigns over the course of 30-year period for the suffragists. And sometimes in places like New York, they got the law passed and then it got overturned. So imagine that, being the suffragists and working so hard and then seeing a state just knock out what you've got. But it actually is like jujitsu. You need to draw the challenge in, and then you build the ordinances in the local law in such a way so that it begins to organize 10,000 people at a time rather than just 3 or 4.
Yes.
From earlier this evening, I was understanding that smaller communities like the Maldives are buying parts of India. I heard a while back some nearly underwater island was suing a group of industries because they were sinking their island with global warming. In the way of natural rights, I presume the polar bears have an inalienable right to starve to death when there's no longer polar ice, I kind of have the feeling myself that when a small community or any group tackles a particular issue, to a degree, they're deciding whether to set their deck chair facing forward, facing aft, fold it up against the wall and lean on the railing. But basically nobody is actually grabbing a life jacket. And I would suggest that if we don't regulate a lot differently and a lot faster than we have been, we will be regulated, because forces that have no interest in our Constitution will regulate us.
Well, we would say they're doing that now. I mean, the constitutional structure is set up for a reason the way that it is. But I agree with the deck chair analogy when we talk about conventional activism that we've been doing. I mean, you would think that the actors that are causing climate change should be liable to the countries themselves who are experiencing climate change. You would think that. You would think that countries who have not taken any steps to deal with climate change or signed Kyoto, as limited as the Kyoto Protocol is, should be liable to those countries who are losing their countries because of climate change. You would think all those things, but there's no legal structure set up to allow them to do that. And we're waiting for the moment when one of them puts something in place that allows them to go after the companies and the countries that are actually allowing their island or enabling their island to sink. And we may wait a long time for that, or it may happen around the corner. We don't know.
Yes?
I'm in a unique position. I actually have the law on my side. I'm an elected official in this state. I'm a PUD commissioner in the county where our state's capital is. And RCW 54 specifically states how a utility that's publicly owned in our state, specifically a public utility district, can go into other forms of utilities if it's operating only in one or many. And I want to point out to people, of course, in Seattle, the municipality runs your utility for both electricity and water. So there are municipal forms, there are countywide forms, mutuals, and co-ops like in the San Juan Islands. So they're a rather common form of ownership. About 50% of the electricity in this state is publicly owned. The origins of the conservation movement originally during the Teddy Roosevelt era worked to keep ownership of natural resources such as hydropower in the public domain. This is the origins of the conservation movement, despite what current environmental organizations are doing. Today, the Northwest has over half the nation's hydropower within its Columbia River Basin, and yet only Nebraska has completely publicly owned electric utilities, even though it's a fairly conservative state. It happened a long time ago, and they've benefited greatly from it. Our state, like I mentioned before, is probably second largest with about 50%. The movement still continues. It's not stagnant. 3 counties in 2008 voted on electric PUDs, and only one was successful, where Port Townsend is today, Jefferson County, and they will take ownership of their electric utility, their already water and sewer district, in 2013, in about a year and a half from now. And so I just wanted to point out that 2 others have failed. It's not an easy process, but if public gets involved and engaged, you do, by law, have the ability to at least concern yourself with utilities, which are basic services that meet human needs, and people should have a greater say in what they do.
Thank you very much. That was really good to hear. Okay, last question.
You were talking about the EPA earlier, and, the EPA is the Environmental Protection Agency, right? And so this brings up the question of the precautionary principle, right? It should be precautionary, right? We protect the environment. That's precautionary. But, my question has to do with why the European Union, can ban GM foods and things under the precautionary principle, whereas we don't seem to have that here. Why is it the United States can't be precautionary? Global warming, that's another one right there. It's once it's happened, you can't turn back the clock and make it not happen. It has to be precautionary. So, what is it about our law here in the United States where there has to be a certain number of bodies that pile up before, so you can start to maybe regulate a chemical or something that might take you 20 years or something, to stop that, or a practice or something.
Why do you think? And plus, there's just add something to that, which is people. We have the DEP in Pennsylvania, the Department of Environmental Protection, and so people pick up the phone thinking that they're actually about environmental protection, and so some folks have come up with the phrase "the Department of Everything Permitted," because that seems to be what the DEP does, and so we tend to think about the regulatory system as being protective somehow, but we think less about the regulatory system being permissive. That the regulatory system, when it writes a permit, it legalizes something that would otherwise be illegal, at least under common law kind of principles. And so the people come to us and say, well, Mr. Linzey, the regulatory system is broken. It's not protecting our health, safety, and welfare, to which we say, well, maybe it's not broken, maybe it's working perfectly, because its purpose is not to protect health, safety, and welfare. The purpose is to enable certain harms to occur and to legalize those harms. And when you look at the history of regulatory agencies, the first regulatory agency was the Interstate Commerce Commission, which was in essence set up to protect the interests of the major railroad companies by setting up regulations that smaller railroad companies couldn't interfere with the marketplace. And so we almost need a complete reanalysis of what regulatory agencies are all about, because I think we throw out all the time. We say, oh, that needs to be regulated. It's some kind of protective thing. But the cigarette companies, some of them were working for active regulation of nicotine because they understand that it provides a stable capital climate when you have a regulatory regime in place that locks in the ownership control of a small number of corporations. And so we have to start thinking about the regulatory system in a different way. It's not necessarily a protective mechanism. It's actually something that legalizes stuff that would otherwise be illegal.
I've got a response to that. I think that we also have to look at the basis for the environmental regulatory system, and it is purely quote scientific unquote. In other words, environmental standards, whether or not you can use a particular chemical, what levels you can emit, whether something is so-called safe or not, is based on scientific information where we have it. As I said, and a lot of times we don't have it. And when we don't have it, things are permitted because there is a presumption, there's an a priori assumption of safety until something is proven guilty. So all of our environmental regulations are based on science. They are not based on what should we do. They are not based on an ethical consideration of rights, what is the appropriate thing to do, what is the thing to do for sustainability, what is the healthy thing to do, what is good for people. None of that, all of that information is essentially irrelevant in the policy process. The policy process is based mostly, at least in theory, on science. I'm not saying that there aren't other interests at work here, largely corporate interests, of course, but the given rationale for environmental policy standards is scientific. It's what is the no observed effects level, factor it, give an uncertainty factor, and there you get your standard. So that is how the system is meant to work. It is not meant to address questions of what is the right thing to do, what will make the society sustainable, what is the ethical thing to do, what gives people rights. Irrelevant questions in the policy process. Because I was getting to that, because in Europe, I believe that there is still a much more communitarian sense of ethical rights. There is a much more developed sense of what? Social? No, I wouldn't call it socialism. What I would, the commons. The commons I would accept, yes, of what is the right thing to do in these circumstances. That is much more alive in Europe than I believe it is in this country. And why isn't it alive in this country? Because this country is so much more, has adopted economics so much more as the fundamental and the drive for profit as the fundamental motivation of society, and money as the driver of society in a way that I don't see it in Europe to the same extent.
And when you unwrap it further down to the constitutional stuff and the laws that deal with corporations, in Canada, for example, there have been communities that have passed sludge bans. And people ask, well, why can you do it there but not in the U.S.? Well, it turns out the Canadian Constitution is structured differently. Corporations don't have all the same rights in Canada that they have in the United States. And you know, that happens across the globe, for good or for bad. In South Africa, which has, you know, what most people point to as this glowing constitution, we sent our constitutional lawyers over to South Africa to take corporate personhood and put it directly into their constitution provisions. So in the U.S., our corporate personhood, corporate rights stuff is judicial. It's judges giving decisions. But our lawyers here, who were sent out to South Africa to assist with the drafting of the new constitution, took corporate rights and actually codified it directly into their constitution. And so the law is always evolving, and stuff is always getting worse because it's our model that's being exported out to those other places. But when you unwrap the leaves and start looking at exactly the doctrines that are used to do these different things, what you find in the European countries as well as Canada, that the corporations don't have as many rights as they have in the United States. So it's unwrapping that piece as well.
Okay, I know we're running a little late. It's been a fascinating conversation. We'll have little breakout groups for any of you that want to have more specific questions with our two guests, but we will have to leave shortly. I want to thank both Thomas and Kate. This was an incredibly interesting conversation that the two of you have helped bring to this group in this region, and I look forward to seeing what comes out of these sorts of discussions. So thank you all very much.